Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast Live, being streamed on LinkedIn, on YouTube and on Facebook. Welcome if you're joining us. If you are, you can post a comment. Hopefully all the technology working, I'll be able to see that and feed it into our conversation. So to start off, test if it's working, test if anyone is out there. If you're in the UK, I think the weather's beautiful, and you're crazy if you're inside watching me, but I appreciate it. So say hello in the comments, and let's see whereabouts you are in the world. For those of you who haven't tuned in before, welcome. I'm Andy Lapata. I'm the host of the Connected Leadership Podcast. We broadcast live on LinkedIn, Facebook, on YouTube whenever I record an interview for my podcast. And then these interviews then go out on the podcast every Monday and Thursday. So we record I'd call a long interview, by podcast standards, fairly average, about 45 minutes, on a particular theme that's related to the role of professional relationships in leadership roles. But we as you'll see today, we move around that. And then a 15-minute podcast around some specific professional relationships and self-development questions. But we record all in one go. So we'll be with you for about an hour or so today. If you are watching thinking it's live, but you're actually at a different time, it's now just gone 2:15 on Friday afternoon in very bright weather in the UK. So I sometimes see people post "Hello Andy" on Monday mornings, so just so you know exactly where you are. But this is a great interview, so listen on anyway. The podcast will be going out on this interview will be going out on the podcast on Monday and Thursday next week. Before we get into the content of today's podcast, just to apologise to anyone who saw me promote an interview on Wednesday, streaming on Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday morning. Unfortunately, my guest's computer packed up, which meant that we've had to reschedule. So we're getting that into the diary, but we have a lot of really interesting interviews coming up in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So keep your eyes peeled, both on these channels, LinkedIn, Facebook and YouTube Live, and also on the Connected Leadership Podcast. The easiest way to access that is either through any podcast provider like Spotify, iTunes, anything along those lines, but also you can go direct to it by going to podfollow.com/connected leadership. I was going to spell that out for you, and then I remembered that it's on my nameplate, so you can just take it straight from there, make your life easier. Right, let's get to today's podcast, and I am joined by someone who is a columnist for Inc. He's a contributor to the Harvard Business Review, a contributor to Forbes, CNBC, the Wall Street Journal, you name it, he has contributed to it. He is an expert in his field, in other words. He's also the author of a book called The Feedback Fix, and that's our topic for today. Fearless feedback, I've called it. And it's, in terms of leadership and professional relationships, I thought that this would be an absolutely perfect fit. When I look back at the conversations I've had as a business leader, as a manager in my younger days, and also just personal conversations as well, I recognise that feedback, both as a giver of and receiver of, is just spiked with challenges and issues. It is so easy to destroy a relationship because of the way that you deliver feedback or the way it's received. And I think this is an absolutely key discussion. So I'm delighted to be focusing on this today. And of course, do give me feedback on the Connected Leadership Podcast, and hopefully it's all positive because I've got a very fragile ego. We'll talk about that and more with my guest today. So welcome to Joe Hirsch. Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast.
Hi, Andy. Pleasure to be with you.
So you're joining us from the States today. Whereabouts are you based, Joe?
I'm in Maryland on the eastern seaboard, and it's also a beautiful day here in Maryland. I plan on being outdoors like the rest of your listeners in just a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think once this is recorded and edited and I'm all set for it to go out on Monday, I haven't been out other than to take my rubbish out for 2 days. That's not good in this weather. So I plan to remedy that afterwards. But people don't want to hear about me taking out the rubbish. They want to hear about fearless feedback. So let's get straight into the topic. the first thing I did when I came across your work was I had a look at your TED Talk, and it's an 8-minute TED Talk, so it's quite a short one, but it gets right to the point. It's really impactful, and I highly recommend it. I thought it was really interesting, and you talk in there about how you used to avoid feedback and how that impacted your relationships and your performance in your job. Can you just explain a little bit about that, just to set the scene for us?
Yeah, so the talk was called The Joy of Getting Feedback, which kind of feels like a cruel joke, right? For many of us, there's no joy in feedback, whether that's delivering it or receiving it. It's more like a source of fear than a cause for joy. And for most of my life, that's exactly what it felt like. I was completely avoidant. I did not like getting feedback, especially anything that did not confirm with the view I held of myself. And it got to a point where I became so averse to feedback that I stopped knowing what others were really thinking of me. And over time, that knowledge gap built and accrued and grew into something so challenging that it reached a point where I was no longer able to maintain healthy relationships with my colleagues at work. It had impacted friendships that I had outside of work. And it reached a tipping point where a professional crisis put me into some pretty difficult situations. And it almost came out of nowhere, but it really didn't. Right? It had been building over time. And so that lack of knowing what others were thinking, that aversion to finding out the uncomfortable truths about myself, that actually put me in a worse position, professionally and personally, than had I been more open to getting feedback in the first place. And it caused me to really look hard, not only at myself and my own tendencies, but at what the research tells us about how to give and receive feedback. That eventually became the Feedback Fix. It has since become a book that's been translated into several languages, one of which is Korean. And I mention that specifically because the word for feedback in Korean, and if you have any listeners in Korea, pardon my pronunciation, but the word for feedback in Korean is gotsede, gotsede, which is not a perfect translation of feedback, but essentially means to evolve. That's the etymology of the word. And I love that because that's ultimately what good feedback is meant to do, to help us evolve, to help us engage, to help us discover the parts of ourselves we might not want to know about, but need to encounter. And that set a journey in place for me that ultimately helped me realize that feedback can absolutely be a cause for joy and not fear.
I love that, and I love this concept of feedback, being there to help us evolve, because that's exactly what it's for. But we do tend to live in fear of it. I can picture straight away the scene of I need to see you in the morning, or someone waiting for their appraisal, and people don't look forward to those meetings with joy, anticipation. They tend, I'm generalizing, they tend to look towards them, not forward to them, but towards them, with fear, as you say. Now, often when I ask that first question, and we get some foundation of what we're going to get into, sort of 3 or 4 things immediately jump to my mind. The one I think that where my mind was going as you were sharing your response was, I think many people listening to this will resonate with the idea of the challenge of feedback, the need to be able to embrace it more, the fact that it can help us evolve. I think that will make sense and be familiar to many people. The way you outlined your own experience may sound, and I could be completely wrong here, may sound an extreme version of it. The fact that it was impacting your personal and professional life to such an extent that it was damaging relationships, it was damaging your prospects. Was your experience from your subsequent research, would you say your experience was on the extreme fringes, or is it more common? And how did that actually play out?
So I don't think my experience is all that unique. I think for many people, the fear of getting feedback and even the fear of delivering the feedback causes people to resist and retreat rather than engage and encounter. And that has many implications, certainly in the professional context, but also in our personal lives. It impacts the way that we relate to our colleagues, the way we relate up to our bosses and managers, the way we talk to our own children, the way we engage with our friends, whether we decide to leave a tip for the driver, how many stars to award, the seller on an online purchase. Feedback is a uniquely human endeavor, which is why it produces such a uniquely human response when we feel like our status is challenged or our safety is questioned. And deep on a neuro level, this is exactly what happens every single time we're asked this question: can I give you some feedback? We get the tingle in our back, we get the sweaty palms, we get the shaky knees, our throat becomes a little scratchy, much like mine just was. And we start to feel not like ourselves. And many people feel this way. In fact, I ask people all the time, whether it's leaders that I'm working with across industries, and I've had the great privilege of working with some wonderful leaders at some of the biggest brands, both here in the United States and internationally. The question of when I give feedback, I feel, and they complete the prompt. And for most people, it's anxious, it's nervous, it's hesitant, it's scared. Negative emotions or neutral negative emotions that come to the point of, I don't much like what I'm about to do because I sense that it's about to create a negative feeling in the person who's about to hear it from me. I'm about to make someone feel like less of himself or herself, not more. And if I'm on the receiving end, I become incredibly nervous. In fact, if you look at brain scans, the parts of our brains that are responsible for creativity, for executive function, for planning, all of these parts, the parts that make us who we are, they literally go dark whenever we are challenged with this question of, can I give you some feedback? And I think it's a common problem, but there are also some particular solutions. And that's the benefit of this approach that I've developed. It doesn't focus on a past that people can no longer change. It looks out towards a future that they still can. It's not focused on what makes them less like themselves, but what makes them more like themselves. And ultimately, it's about creating partnership and not engaging with power. And when we change that mindset around feedback, both the giver and the receiver have an on-ramp for healthier, more constructive conversations, grounded in partnership, driven by the promise of potential and the still unfolding future that we are all capable of writing for ourselves. And that's where I think we can actually begin to make an appreciable difference in how people perceive feedback. It doesn't have to be a landmine. It can be a landmark, and I think even a launch point.
I love the way, and we both are in the same industry. We probably both do the same thing to a degree. I love the way you come up with these quotable phrases, and it doesn't have to be a landmine. It can be a landmark or a launch pad. You had me speechless. I thought that was poetic and wonderful.
Thank you. I probably could write Hallmark cards if this doesn't work.
So I think that's the first time I've been speechless on a podcast. But I thought I had to reference that. I had to honour that. And there were a couple other things that you said there. To be able to move that feeling, that anticipation of receiving feedback from a position of wanting to avoid it to wanting to embrace it is a fantastic aspiration. I want to get to what the structure is. You've given us an indication of what it's looking to achieve. I want to get to that point. But first of all, let's look at how it happens at the moment. So I want to look at feedback in 4 ways. The way we give feedback, which I know is your area of speciality specifically. Also how we receive it, which I know you've studied and understand as well. And I think both are important. As for leaders, we need to be able to deliver it, and we need to be able to receive it if we're going to evolve. And I want to look at those in a formal and informal setting, because again, both play equally important roles. So let's start out with giving feedback and the formal setting. What mistakes are leaders and organisations making at the moment that they need to recognise and see this is what we have to address?
Yeah, there are really three areas. And in the work that I do with a number of organizations here in the United States, I see really three common traps. One is timing, the other is tone, and the third is trajectory. Timing is an issue that many organizations have now addressed. Used to be that feedback was given annually, maybe semi-annually, and now many organizations here in the US and even around the world have shifted the cadence of feedback to more continuous fluid check-in. So that's no longer the biggest barrier for many organizations. People have come around to the idea that feedback can't be seasonal sport. It has to be something that is rooted in the rhythm of work. It has to flow with the natural conversations that are taking place at work. And ultimately, it has to be something that can deliver a certain frequency that allows people to do something with the information. Otherwise, it's like looking back on events months after they've occurred and trying to reconstruct them to no avail or success. So timing is not the biggest issue for many anymore, but tone and trajectory still are. Because the tone invariably, Andy, becomes negative when we start to operate through the prism of weaknesses rather than strengths. And much has been said about focusing on strengths-based feedback versus weakness feedback. I mean, think of a hot air balloon and imagine trying to launch this balloon into the air. So there's two ways to get the hot air balloon to rise. You can add helium, or you can relieve the weight. You can take the weight off. So that, I believe, is my metaphor for how many organizations are approaching this problem. Some organizations just want to shed weight. Others want to put air. And I think that while it's certainly important to address in a corrective fashion the problems that are holding people back, and not to be Pollyannish about it, but to realize that, yeah, there are deficits. People do need to address those. The most empowering way, according to research, to get people to buy in and to engage and execute on good feedback is to operate through the prism of strengths. So the tone should always operate not on what you can't do, but what you can. And to shift the tone from judgment to inquiry. And that's both for the giver and for the receiver. For giver and receiver to approach feedback with less telling and selling and much more listening and learning. And that's a major aspect of the work that I do with leaders, is to shift that tone from one that is prescriptive, me telling you what I see, me selling you on that version and view, to description, me helping you understand where I'm coming from and helping you see that picture in a more complete way. And the other is trajectory, helping someone look out at a future they can still change and control, rather than looking back on a past that they can't. And to do this, I like to think of the art and science of giving feedback in terms of this cute little metaphor that I like to use: mirror holding or window gazing. Okay, and I wrote about this in Harvard Business Review some time ago. Window gazing is what happens when you tell and sell. Right? That's what happens when I'm telling you my version of events. I'm selling you on my view. And when the power dynamics are such that there's really just one view that matters, and it's the view of the gazer, the boss, the manager, the person with the power, the person with the perspective, that's the view that prevails. So it doesn't really open up any space for the other person. What they see is completely irrelevant and crowded out by the view of the other person. When you shift the trajectory of feedback to looking out towards the future rather than back at the past, the view right now shifts to the other person on the other side of that conversation, and that's mirror holding. My job now as a leader, as a friend, as a spouse, as a partner, is simply to hold the mirror up to you for you to see a more enlarged and expanded view of your own performance and potential as an employee, as a husband, as a wife, as a son, as a daughter, as a friend, as a community member. Who are you and who are you becoming? And that shift in trajectory of mirror holder from window gazer, that makes a dramatic difference in how people see themselves and, frankly, the other person giving that feedback. Because once you create more space for me to engage as your partner, I am better able to fill that space with information that is important to me that might not be known to you, and makes me think of you as more credible as a leader giving feedback, because you've invited me in to that conversation. You've given me more voice. You've given me more choice. And you've given me an opportunity to share the things that are most important to me, the things that you may not even know, but together we can solve and develop.
Welcome to Belle Namre, who's a regular joiner on our live broadcast, who said she's watching on Facebook, says she likes the mirror image, who I am. So that's really resonating with her. That description is making me question, I think, what is probably an agreed wisdom about the way that feedback interviews should take place, and that is it tends to be, in circles I've been in, understood that the person receiving the feedback should listen, and that's it. What's your view on when and how the person receiving feedback should engage in the conversation?
Yeah. So if leaders are actually designing a feedback system that is built on true partnership, then those opportunities are embedded in the conversation. They're creating portals for people to become participants, and those naturally flow. But let's say a leader doesn't do that very well yet. Let's say leaders still are doing a lot of telling and selling or firefighting, and that's especially in times of change like the ones we are in currently. There is a tendency among leaders I've observed to hold on to some of that power, to try to be the problem solver and to view people as problems, not problem solvers. And they're the leaders are the ones who are trying to solve the problems. And so there's not a lot of space for others to be participants and partners in this process of growth and development. And that's why it's even more important, I think, and I coach people to do this, on how to flip the script and develop agency in this area of feedback and asking for it. Because you can't control the feedback you receive, but you can control the manner in which it is shared. And what I mean by that is that the events that will be discussed and described, those are immutable. You can't do anything about that. That's part of a pattern, that's part of a history, it's part of our record. But we can control the manner in which it is shared by setting ourselves up for greater success in these conversations. And I think you can do that both as a leader giving the feedback and as an employee receiving the feedback with smart shifts in how you approach it. So for the leader, it's about operating with a greater sense of inquiry and humility, about trying to be the mirror holder rather than the window gazer, recognizing there are things that you don't know, and there are tools and techniques that I've developed that help leaders do exactly that, to design the opportunities for engagement and true two-way dialogue between leaders and their employees. And if you're an employee who's on the receiving end, there are smart switches that you can do as well to elicit that feedback on your own terms and timetable, with greater chances for success in your own behavioral change, professionally and personally. And it really all comes down to being more deliberate and being more intentional, whether you're on the giving side or on the receiving side. And there are things we can do to make that happen.
So, okay, I'm going to come back to this question of mindsets, because I think that's a really important one. We've been skirting around the structure that you like in order to build a formal feedback process. So can we dig a bit deeper into that? What's the approach that you coach and you teach to put something positive in place in organizations?
Yeah. So if you're a leader, and that's primarily where most of my work occurs, in the leadership space, and helping leaders design and deliver fearless, frictionless feedback, it starts with how you are approaching the problem. Okay. Begin with a change in your mindset. We talked about becoming a mirror holder, not a window gazer, listening and learning, not telling and selling, inquiry instead of an inquisition. And then it's important at that point to create opportunities for real partnership and to shrink your size to allow the other person to become larger. So how do you do that? Well, if you're trying to solve a just-in-time problem, there's something that needs immediate attention, or there's something that you really need to address. The way to do that is to address the issue very, very head on, with candor and with clarity, but most importantly, with collaboration. And there's a 4-step process that I like. And I know we were talking about this before the show, about alternatives to the praise sandwich. And this is one that I think is very effective. You know, the praise sandwich, which you had a very funny example of in terms of judging other people's performance in speech competitions. I think that was fantastic. One of the big problems with the praise sandwich, the biggest problem with the praise sandwich, is not the praise, but it's a sandwich. Because according to research, when we share mixed messages, a piece of criticism tucked in between and sandwiched in between two competing critical messages, we tend to lose sight of it. It diminishes the message, and it even, according to research, creates more feelings of distrust between me and the person giving it. I wonder, why aren't you just coming straight out and telling me what it is that you want to say? Why are you dodging and disguising rather than just hitting it straight up? So if that creates uncertainty and fear, then this other alternative, which I call a wrap, is actually so much more satisfying and impactful. The wrap stands for what and where, reason, affect with an A, and prompt. And it's a 4-part alternative to having more caring and collaborative conversations with the people around you in a way that creates space for them to engage as your partner. And instead of skirting the real issue or hiding it between two gauzy, sometimes inauthentic pieces of praise, you come right out and you say what's happening and where it's happening. You give the feedback a destination. You give it a zip code, at least it's what we call it here in the United States. You tell people exactly what's happening, where it's happening, and then you give the reason for why it's important to have that conversation. You would say things like, you know, John, I would like to talk to you about something that happened earlier in one of our Zoom sales calls. I noticed that when we were going through the pipeline, you cut off Samantha and Teresa. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention because A, I care about you. And B, I sensed that there was a tremendous discomfort among the other members of our team when that happened. Now, freeze that for just a second and imagine the impact of being specific and being descriptive on that conversation. All too often, we get general, hazy notions of the feedback. Can I give you some feedback? Well, about what? About my sales call? About my pipeline? About my breath? About my inability to function on Zoom? I mean, what is it exactly? And the mind starts racing and bracing, and that triggers the fear response that is so hardwired into these conversations. Immediately, by giving it a destination, we address most of the concerns. We don't eliminate all the fear, but we mitigate it. And then by giving the reason, we do another important thing. By being descriptive, we let people know, A, with greater certainty what's happening. Again, certainty is what helps people feel more in control. And if feedback is scary because it engenders that fear response for most people, it's because psychologically they no longer feel in control of a conversation or in charge of themselves. So if we help restore some of that control, some of that autonomy, then people feel a little more resolved about what's about to happen. They may not love it, but at least they know what's happening. So we've given a clear sense of what's happening and where it's happening and the reason for why it's happening to restore a sense of control. Here's where the last two parts of this wrap approach make a tremendous difference. And here's where, for leaders, this is what really allows the tone and trajectory to shift. By describing affect, we make a very fundamental shift in how these conversations unfold. Rather than engaging in recrimination and blame, you should have done this, you didn't do that, which triggers, again, defensiveness and aggression, and again, puts people against each other as adversaries rather as partners. You approach with the affect, which is the emotional impact of the behavior. So rather than telling John, you really were impolite in that sales call, or you really you didn't seem to have a sense of boundaries, you shift to how it made you feel. I felt badly, John, for Teresa and Samantha, who clearly were trying to get a word in, but were unable to due to the give and take of this conversation, which wasn't much of a conversation. And I felt badly that we as a team missed a chance to engage as partners and to surface all the information that might have risen to our attention and our collective focus. So that's a different conversation. Rather than issuing blame and judgment, I'm positioning the conversation in terms of the emotional impact. And here's the human truth, Andy. People can argue with what we say, but they are less likely and even unwilling to disagree with how we feel. Because my feelings are my own. And you can't tell me how I ought to feel. This is how I feel. And so we've moved this conversation now to a safer space, to a point where we can still engage as partners. And that's where the last part of this wrap approach comes in with the prompt. Once you've talked about what's happening and where it's happening and the reason for why it's important, and you've discussed affect rather than judgment, this is where we say, okay, John, so where do we go from here? What do we do next? Rather than me telling and selling on what I think ought to happen, I'm giving John the opportunity to do that for himself, for him to find the space and the safety of his own idea. And you know what happens when that happens? More often than not, the idea that will be suggested by the other person is as good or even better than the one that you will come up with yourself. And the reason is because though we are amateurs at how we come across to others, we are professionals about how we can be true to ourselves. And ultimately, we're the closest ones to the action. We just need someone to hold that mirror and give us some frame of reference to see the more complete picture of our performance. Because when they do that, we are better able to engage and execute on what really needs to happen for positive, lasting change and results.
I think that's a really great structure. It makes a huge amount of sense. I was worried when you said that your approach is to rap, that you were going to go a different direction with that. I was glad there was a W at the beginning of it. I have a particular question myself about what you've said, but before I do, Bal has asked on Facebook, can this be SMART feedback? And she's used an acronym SMART. I don't know.
Yes.
So you're obviously familiar with that.
I think she's referring to specific, measurable, actionable, relatable,
realistic,
and
time-bound. Yeah.
And absolutely. I think much better to give SMART feedback than dumb feedback, which is disengaged, which is unwinding, which is meandering, and which is blistering. And that's why it's so important to be very specific, to be candid, to be caring, but ultimately to be collaborative. Because I'd much rather live in a world where I know what others are thinking of me than a world in which I don't. And that was my problem, going back to how we started our conversation with, that personal anecdote of mine, which is still a very profoundly personal and guiding moment for me. I think about it often. I think about how I was operating in darkness. I didn't know what people were thinking or feeling. And because I didn't know, mainly through my own lack of wanting to know, I was put at a tremendous disadvantage and I did great harm to myself and to others. I think when leaders engage with this approach, they're ultimately being smarter not only about their leadership, but also about their relationships. Because ultimately, feedback, as we've said, is this uniquely human endeavor. It's the most human thing we do at work every day. And if we are more caring and more courageous in the way in which we have and hold these conversations, we can do so much good for the people around us. It's actually a gift. I mean, people talk about feedback as a gift. It doesn't often feel that way. But when you shift the dynamics from judgment and blame to description and deep connection, when you shift from a past that people can't change to a future that they can, when you stop engaging as a power broker and start engaging as a partner, when you stop telling and selling as a window gazer and start listening and learning as a mirror holder, that is the moment when you create deeper connection with your employees. They will feel more connected to you. They will feel more trusting of your leadership, and they're going to feel more empowered to make the changes that are necessary in their own professional and personal lives. And they've done so with your help. You have shown them where to look without telling them what to see.
So you're making a great case for the positive side of feedback and creating a culture where feedback is embraced and anticipated rather than feared. Before we get there, there's that moment where you tee up the feedback conversation. So when you were outlining your rap structure, I was a bit confused to understand, does this come when you set up the conversation, or is it the whole conversation in one go? Because what we don't want to do with feedback is spring it on people out of the blue, particularly if you're in a culture of feedback fear.
Yep.
So how do you, if you've got to that hallowed ground where everyone embraces feedback, this isn't a problem. But let's take this from the point where people still fear it. How much of the rap conversation do you have to tee it up, rather than saying, "Can I give you some feedback? Can we meet?" And how much can you share without having the other person stew over what you've just shared about their behaviour on the Zoom call?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great clarifying questions. And I think it starts by being very specific and upfront. First of all, asking the person for a time and a place that works for them so that they're not caught off guard and they feel like they can be comfortable and present in that conversation. And so asking permission to give the feedback seems insignificant, but it's actually very important. And I do stress for leaders that this is something they ought to do. And once you find a time and a place, and I would be specific in that email or in that drive-by conversation, say, hey, can we just talk about something that happened in the meeting earlier today? I just wanted to talk about, and give the reason like we talked about. You can give the first two steps of the wrap as a tee up, just so that people don't naturally wander off to places like, well, what's about to happen? And they start anticipating with dread this conversation that is going to result in them feeling like less of themselves rather than more. So be specific up front, elicit a time and a place that works for them, and then get right into it. I would repeat the steps. I'd go back to what and where and the reason. And with the reason, I'd be very specific because, again, people want that certainty, and people also famously are unaware of how they show up at work and in life. 90% of us, so that probably includes you and me, Andy, although maybe you're more self-aware than I am, have only 10% self-awareness. And that knowledge gap is significant. Psychologists call this the actor-observer effect, that when I am giving feedback, I am primarily focused on an outcome rather than a process. I can't understand why others aren't understanding what I see. And why can't they just perceive things the way I do, when in reality, they are seeing me show up in a completely different way than the way that I think I'm presenting. And for all these reasons, it's important to give clarity around feedback and to talk about the reasons for why you want to talk about this, because People may just not know, and they might want to. And there's a bit of a revelation that occurs in these feedback conversations. So you always want from the start to give ask for permission, find a time and place that works for people, make them feel as comfortable as possible, and be very honest with them. And use these 4 steps of talking about what and where, and the reason, and the affect, and then ultimately the prompt. It really is meant to be a conversation. And as for your other point, what about the people who are not yet prepared to engage as a partner? They still receive feedback with hesitancy or defiance. So I've seen one of 2 things happen when leaders do the wrap approach. I've actually been in the room to watch. This is an unbelievable thing. For most people, when they deliver feedback this way, the receiver is gracious and engages and feels fortunate that he or she now has an opportunity to participate as a partner in this process of improvement, rather than just receive the other person's view. But I was in the room once when a leader was giving one of her direct reports this particularly delicate message, and she used the wrap approach. And you could see the person on the other end of that conversation start to cringe, fidget in his seat, and start to scowl. And by the time this leader got to the point of, well, Jim, what do you think we can do about this next? Jim launched into, I wouldn't call it quite a tirade, but a litany of reasons why his boss was completely off base, in respectful but very forceful tone. So here's why I think that was a great moment for this leader and for this employee, because at least now we know with greater clarity that there is something beneath the surface. This isn't just about the particular issue that the leader wanted to talk about. There was something more deep-seated, more consequential, that was lurking beneath the surface, that had she not engaged this way, she would never have known that there was something seething with this individual that was just kind of waiting to explode. And so by giving permission for other people to speak their minds and to share their views of where they want to go, you as a leader will gain this insight that is so important to how you're managing your teams, your process, your products. Because without that real understanding, you're operating in the dark. And so whether or not someone is ready to engage fully and to embrace this opportunity to be a partner, I still think there could be hidden benefits in the approach, because it gets issues out on the surface. And for leaders, operating with clarity is so much more powerful than operating in darkness.
I can definitely see the value of that, and that's a great example of showing it. I think that as you were describing how you would tee up the conversation, and you talked about self-awareness, putting myself into those shoes of receiving that comment. If someone said to me, this happened on this call, I want to explore this with you in a session, I think my natural defensive instincts would kick in. So I'm going to I'm going to brew those up over a period. So by the time we get into the meeting, I'm in defensive or aggressive defensive mode, which that particular employee may well have been in. Now that may say more about me than anything else, and there is a certain amount of self-awareness and an understanding of your ability to take on board criticism, which I guess, and this is going to have to be part 2 of an interview, I'm afraid. We're not going to cover everything today. But that's the other element of it, is the receiving of feedback rather than the structure of giving it. But that's just the one sticking point for me, is I agree it is better to give people an understanding of what you want to talk to them about than leave them in the dark. The challenge is, if you don't position it in the right light, then they're going to start stewing, and the aggression will rise. They won't sleep. It's going to impact their work. The example you gave, they might be looking at those 2 colleagues and thinking, what have you said about me, or whatever it might be. So how do you manage that? I'm sorry if I'm labouring that point, but for me, this is a really big sticking point.
So I think there's two things that leaders can do to help create the right conditions for that, the right dynamics. The first is to model it. Right? And so when feedback is a modeled behavior, then it becomes an adopted behavior. So leaders should ask for feedback in this kind of way. They should engage in a partnership and say, hey, look, I'm sure there are things that you've seen or observed or felt about the way that we're interacting with one another that could be helpful for me. So is there something that you think could help make our relationship more productive, more constructive, more collaborative? And once leaders start to give permission for those conversations to occur, it immediately builds trust between the two individuals, the leader and the employee, because it is no longer seen as something to be feared or avoided, but something to be embraced and celebrated. We acknowledge that there are things we can be doing better. We are never finished developing. And if leaders make that possible, then they allow everyone around them to engage in a similar fashion. So that's one. The other, I think, would be to make feedback so natural to the relationship that it feels almost like just a part of everyday business. If you create a high stakes encounter, it's going to create a certain intensity and a certain fear. So move out of high stakes and move into high touch, okay? It should not be something that happens only some of the times, informal settings. It can be something that is more natural and conversational. In fact, utilizing existing meetings is something I just did with a financial services company based here in the United States. They started developing cause for applause. Okay, this is a neat little thing they started doing in their weekly meetings. So cause for applause was a way to celebrate not only the great moments, but also the flops. And that's also what's very important, is to not see shortcomings as setbacks, but rather as starting points for growth. And cause for applause was a way for leaders to not only share their own things that they were proud of, among their team, among the employees, but for employees to do the same. And it created this wonderful dynamic where people would be open with one another about the good and the bad, and to engage together as true partners in a process of development, because we're never finished growing and we're never finished improving. And so when we recognize the fact that there are things that are getting in the way of that growth and improvement, we can start to be intentional about addressing it. So I think that's very important for leaders to do, is to see feedback not as a report, but as a relationship. Communication that is candid, but not caring, can be corrosive.
There's that wonderful alliteration again. I'm going to stop you on that point there. I'm just aware of time. There's another question I want to get to. Before I do, you talk about sharing the failures as well as the successes. This came up on a recent podcast as well. I can't remember quite which one, but in the last few weeks. And in my book, Just Ask, we talked about fail fests, where companies have held fail fests to talk and celebrate exactly what you've said, what's gone wrong, so that you can learn from it. And Bal has said on Facebook, my previous CEO used to hold 10-minute conversations once a month with the team individually and together for feedback on him. And he took it seriously and put things right. So that's the sort of modelling that you're talking about. And it all comes back to creating this culture. So the last question for today on this particular topic is, what happens when you're, as a leader, it's not just about if you lead a team. It's leadership, and you've talked about it already, leadership in your community, leadership with your family, leadership with your friends and colleagues and wider networks. And it will come up regularly that you see how someone is engaging with someone else or delivering something, whatever it might be, and you feel that you've picked up something they need to know about, or you can help them improve, you have ideas for them, but they might not always be receptive. They might not have the right mindset. So how do you offer feedback to someone who hasn't asked for it?
With care and with caution. I think this is something I learned very early in my career. You have to really shift from being a know-it-all to a learn-it-all. Okay, and I think that's a hallmark of great leadership, and even of being just a great friend and spouse, partner, father, mother, son, daughter. It's trying to approach again with that inquiry mindset rather than a mindset of forcing reality on people. I'd much rather help people face reality in a new way than to force a new reality on them. So, but I would approach with care, and I would say, look, I want to share this with you because I care about you. I want to share this with some caution because I know that I may not have all the information. I want to tell you something that I saw, and here's how I perceived it. How are you seeing this? How are you receiving this? And I think the combination of care and caution, again, as long as it's embedded in this trusting relationship, is very powerful and ultimately welcomed by people. Here's the thing, Andy. People don't resist change. They resist being changed. And when they feel like you are forcing a reality on them that is not one that they see, know, or like, they're going to resist and retreat. It's human nature. We saw this all throughout the pandemic when companies shifted policies and procedures pretty frequently. I'm still working with a few organizations now that are revisiting their performance management processes, and it has shifted 3 times now since the pandemic broke 18 months ago in terms of having these conversations in a hybrid to a remote first to now back in the office. It's very, very challenging. And the thing is to always remember that people just resist being changed. We want to have that sense of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. We want to be able to be agents of our own success. And we don't like it much when people take it away from us. So if you approach with care, I care about you. I want to share this with you because you matter to me, because this relationship matters to me. And to do so with a note of caution and to say, I don't know that I have all the facts. I think this is what I'm seeing. How are you perceiving it? This combination of care and caution combined with collaboration of really approaching as a partner can have such a dramatic difference in how we have these conversations. It's no longer about blame and fear. It's about partnership and progress. We're not looking back on a past that people can't change. We want to look out to a future that they can. And ultimately, we don't want to force reality on them. We want to help them face reality. And if we do that, then truly feedback can become a source of joy, not a cause for fear.
Joe, fascinating. I thought it would be an important topic when we started discussing it. It absolutely is. I am going to ask you, and I'd never do this, but I'm going to ask you back, if you would, to talk about receiving feedback rather than giving it, if you're happy to do that, maybe in a few months' time.
Sure.
That would be wonderful. You speak with passion and eloquence about a very important topic, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
At the very beginning, you talked about the Korean translation of the word feedback, and you talked about it as being something that helps us evolve. And I think there's a lot that I would hold on to from this conversation, but that's probably one of the most powerful things, because if we can see it as something to help us grow, something to help us evolve, something to help other people grow and evolve, and build that into a culture of communication, then we move away from fear and we move towards embracing the feedback, and that's the important thing. I know you use the term feed forward. We haven't touched on that today. A colleague of mine, Nigel Risner, has been talking about feed forward for a long time as well. It's a great way of positioning it, and yes, I look forward to continuing the conversation. For now, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy.
So, thank you again, Joe. Thank you, Bao, for your contributions as well. We are, as normal, now going to go on to our Thursday podcast. Joe, when I get you back, I've no idea what we'll do on the Thursday because I'll have asked you the questions, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. You've been pre-warned about these ones, and we're looking for about 10 to 15 minutes, about 15 minutes for the podcast. What I'll do is I'm just going to go straight into the first question, and I'll build an intro that will lead into your answer. So don't worry, I'm not going to ask you formally. So the first thing is about the impact that professional relationships have had on your career to date.
There are 2 individuals that I think profoundly shaped and changed the direction of my personal and professional life. The first person was actually when I was going through that moment of turmoil, of crisis in my work where I was completely in the dark. He was the person who acted as that mirror holder that we talked about, who held the mirror to me and asked me, who do you want to be? Because the person that you think you are is not the person that others think you are. And that was a jarring, unsettling moment for me because it literally shook me out of my complacency around this topic about how I saw myself and how I was showing up to others, and sparked within me a desire to be seen the way that I felt, and to create more connection and closeness between those 2 views, between how I saw myself and how others saw me. So that was one. And the other person, I consider him to be like part of my board of personal directors. And he's a fantastic serial entrepreneur, very successful individual. And he asked me once a very important question, and it was like simple, but it was very, very profound at the same time. And it was, why do you think that? And he asked it in the context of something that I was doing in my work, and I actually never thought about why I believed that to begin with. It was just something that I did because maybe I felt others were doing it. It was because I saw others doing it. But I never really took the time to ask myself, why is it that I'm doing this? And he asks me this question often, and it forces me to really stop and think about what is guiding me in my work or in my relationships. What are the principles that are shaping this path? And it causes me to question things. It certainly causes me to be more reflective rather than reflexive. And it helps me become more attuned to the most important things that are part of my life. And that is my principles, my positions, my beliefs. What do I want out of this engagement, out of this conversation, out of this partnership, out of this speaking opportunity, out of this book? What do I want out of this? And then to think backwards and reverse engineer that process and say, okay, this is where I'd like to end up. This is what I want to get out of it. Here's what I have to do to put into it. And that's been profound for me in terms of shaping everything that I do now, both professionally and personally.
I love those questions that make us dig deeper. I often in my training I'll get people to challenge each other with why or so what, until they can't ask why or so what anymore, because then you're getting to the nub of a message. I think we leave so much assumed without challenging it, and just questions like that make such a huge difference, and the impact that you can make and the steps that you take as well. So those are the positives. That's great. What about negative experiences with professional relationships? Where has it gone wrong? And most importantly, what have you learned from the experience?
So we had the chance to talk a lot about the difference of telling and selling versus listening and learning. And I remember one of my very first coaching opportunities, and I come from an educational background, both K-12 as well as higher ed. And one of the first people I ever coached was a colleague at a school that I worked at. And I went into that conversation after observing her teach her lesson, and I proceeded to tell her all the things that I thought she did wrong in that period of instruction, and then to tell her what would make it better. Andy, if I could tell you the look of horror that came on her face, which then turned to disgust and contempt, as she then told me, "I don't know what you think you're doing or what you think you're seeing, but your approach is so terrible." And she said a few other things that you probably can't repeat in a family-friendly show like this. So it was a debacle. I mean, it was an unmitigated disaster. But I learned so much from that conversation. Well, it wasn't even a conversation. It was because it was only one person talking at a time, me telling and then her telling back. But I learned a lot from that, and it really informed my belief that I now hold very deeply about being a learn-it-all, a know-it-all, about listening and learning and not telling and selling, because I made a fatal flaw in that conversation, and it was I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I had sized everything up. I had all the information, and now I needed to fix it. And as we've said, people don't want to be fixed. They want to see where they can improve. No one wants to be forced to change. They want to be provoked and inspired to make these improvements on their own. They'd like to have an insight unlocked for them, not a reality forced upon their heads. And I think that's where we all can do a little better whenever we have these conversations, is to first adopt the position of humility and inquiry, and to say to ourselves, what don't I know about this person, about this situation, about these circumstances, and to give the other person a chance to speak into that space, for him or for her to tell us the things that we don't know yet, because that's very powerful. And when we unlock opportunities for greater understanding and greater insight, we not only learn more about this person and about this problem, but we also draw closer to that person. And it instills a greater sense of trust and connection between us, so that this conversation can become driven by partnership rather than by power.
I am in 4 mastermind groups, and I teach masterminding as well. I don't know if you've come across masterminding or action learning, which is very similar. I'm sure you have. And one of the golden rules when you have a challenge that you're trying to find a solution for is that when you hear the challenge, you cannot provide a solution. You have to ask questions first. And people find it very difficult. And one of the rules that I put in is that you can't mask a solution as a question, like, have you tried this, ... Because that human tendency is, as soon as we hear something, we feel we know. And to have that questioning up front first, it often will uncover the real challenge. So, one of my core stories is that I went to a mastermind group many years ago with a business that was failing. And my challenge to them was, how do I improve the marketing of this business so that it can succeed? The ultimate solution that came out of the questioning was, you need to dump the business and do something you really believe in, because it's never going to work if you don't believe in it. But if we had only focused on, I want marketing ideas, we'd never have got there. So I think that just is exactly what you're talking about, whether it's one-to-one on feedback, whether it's in a group, trying to resolve a challenge, whatever it might be, seek to learn first. Do your research, before you come up with the ideal solution. I must just ask you, on the Monday podcast, we talked about and you just alluded to it, the period you spent where you were averse to receiving feedback. When this conversation took place, was that when you were someone who yourself disliked feedback, or had you got over that hurdle at that time?
No, I was very much in the dark at that point. And as an educator by training and at heart, we give a lot of feedback, but we are not great at receiving it ourselves.
Yeah.
Nor is the system, for that matter, really set up to support courageous conversations about our work, which is a reason why probably 40% of my business is in still the K-12 market, in addition to working with corporate clients as well. And I think that if we approach these conversations with an open mind, then there's room and space for us to grow. You can't change someone's mind by dropping a sledgehammer on them. You'll split their mind, but you're not going to really open it for potential to grow and to evolve. Rather, create almost like a needle point where you can create just the smallest opening for them to think and reflect later on about what you said. Because rare is the person who makes a life change in a fleeting moment, right? I mean, I guess there are some people that do that sort of thing, but I don't know anyone who's completely changed his life or her life and done a 180 on a passing insight or a fleeting moment. We tend to sit and reflect and come back to these things over time. And then there's that moment of, yeah, well, I really do need to make a change. I need to be open to this opportunity or to think about this differently. And for me, that's what happened in that moment. It wasn't like a light bulb moment. I mean, it definitely struck me as something very profound. Like, yeah, I probably need to do something about it. But in terms of actually making the change, that was months and months in the making. That took a long time. And I think ultimately that's where I think a lot of us can do better. We should stop seeing feedback as a lightning bolt and start thinking about it as a drumbeat, right? Not something that is shocking, but something that is steady, something that happens at a pace and a rhythm that we can follow, rather than something that happens only some of the time and catches us off guard. And I think if we march to the drumbeat of fearless feedback, if we start to think about not only who we are, but who we are becoming, and if we as leaders can help shape the path for positive and lasting change by helping people discover the best parts of themselves rather than weigh them down with the worst parts of themselves, then we're going to do a lot of good for people. We're going to change the dynamic of these conversations. We are going to shift the power imbalance that all too often is present in these conversations. And ultimately, we're going to drive more caring, connected, collaborative conversations that are focused on who people can still become rather than who they currently are.
Wonderful. So, last question. What books, what talks, what podcasts have really made an impact on you, and would you recommend to our listeners?
Well, there's so many. I think a few stand out. Books, and it's like asking me who's my favorite of my four sons. They're all great.
Who's your favorite of you?
On the top, I'll tell you something related to what we talked a lot about today. The Power of Collaboration, The Power of Teams. There's a wonderful book called Team Genius by Rich Karlgaard and Mark Malone. That's a wonderful blend of storytelling and science on the power of collaborative frameworks. That's very good. I think we also talked about the power of asking not just what, but why. So Start With Why by Simon Sinek is very important. That was a good book for me. Podcasts. Well, obviously, the Connected Leadership podcast would be at the top of my list. And in addition to that, I think there are a couple that have made a big difference for me. One is Work Life with Adam Grant. The other, and I hope this doesn't come across as like shameless self-promotion, is the podcast that I do, I Wish They Knew. Not because of anything that I say on that show, but because the show is all about what other people wish more people knew about or did. And it's a short form conversation about the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. And I've heard some of the most profoundly life-changing ideas on that show. What people wish others knew. And in a world, Andy, where everyone is talking, isn't it just refreshing to know what others are thinking? And that's what this show is about. It really gives people an opportunity to share the most important ideas that they think deserve more attention in a relatively short amount of time. And I personally have learned so much from those conversations with these individuals who are frankly amazing at what they do. And they share that wisdom and knowledge with our audience and help drive more positive, lasting change in how we see others and ourselves.
Thank you so much, Joe. I think that sounds like a great podcast to listen to. I'll be adding it to my list, and we'll put that in the show notes for everyone as well. Thank you so much for joining me for both podcasts this week.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So thanks to Joe. Thank you for joining me as well. We've got a few interviews booked in over the next 2 or 3 weeks, as I said at the beginning. I always forget to check my diary before I come on, but I'm pretty sure if you look out next Wednesday afternoon UK time, morning and Eastern time, I will be recording my podcast with Ruth Gotian for the beginning of next month. I believe that's 4 p.m. UK next Wednesday, and next Thursday, slightly earlier in our afternoon, slightly earlier in the US morning, I will be speaking with Sabra Horn. Sabra has just left her role, senior role at the US Cyber Security Agency. She's got a fascinating CV, great insights into cyber intelligence, and we'll be looking at the impact of technology and the threats from technology and how that impacts our roles as leaders and our professional relationships. So dates for your diary there. Look out for those on my LinkedIn, on my Facebook and YouTube channels, and also, of course, on the Connected Leadership podcast. Thank you for joining me.